Hello, and welcome back to Fusion Writing, where building character meets creating structure. We are in our map day of Writing Week, and as we introduced yesterday, we are excited to have a special guest, Vanessa Sperling. Victoria, do you want to tell us anything about our Writing Week before we get started?
Mm, um, I don't have anything fancy or new to chime in other than I'm chugging away at the writing of Zettelkasten for fiction writers. So that is coming along very nicely. It's so nice to be back in the saddle and be making progress. So that's where I am. But I want to get ahead and talk to Vanessa and get a fresh perspective on this thing that we are all so much in love with, but that can be such a struggle. Wherever you are in the journey, as we said during the compass, we are all comrades because every project is a new beginning and we all start with beginner's mind. So with that, I would ask Vanessa first, do you want to say a little bit about being an estranged writer? That is something that is dear to my heart because I had about a 20-year delta from the time I started my novel to the time I finished it. So tell us just a little bit about what did your journey look like?
Well, I've got one on you. I'm 40 years that I let it sit. So when I was 14, well, I'll go back. When I was 5 years old, I was convinced that I already was a writer. I loved books. I had parents who read to me all the time. And I discovered that there was this thing that you could make these books. There were authors on the back of these books. So I decided that I was going to be a writer, and I started telling my mother stories and having her write them down for me, which made me a writer. So I like to think that at 5, I was like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be one of those pictures on the back of the books. Well, I actually did try. I wrote little stories, throughout my childhood. And when I was about 14, I was continuing to write stories, but I began to misunderstand how stories work. I don't know how it actually happened, but at some point I had the idea that writers would write down a story immediately. Like they could just come up with a story and then write it down, and then they would send it off and they'd make it into a book. And I don't know how I got that idea, but the fact that I would write the story and then a few weeks later I wouldn't like it and say, well, I never had the idea that I could make it better. It was just wrong because I didn't like it anymore. So again, having that misunderstanding that that's how writing worked, I just gave up and I stopped writing.
That is so common. That is so common. And that's one of the reasons why I advocated so hard for the writing classes that I taught, because that's probably the most common misconception of new writers is they think you sit down, you start at the beginning, you write through to the end, the story's finished, you send it off and it gets published. That is not at all the mechanics of writing, at least not anything I know.
Well,
So
I've never heard of
I'm so glad
anyone
that
who
you brought
could
that
do
up.
that. So yeah, yeah.
Right? But that's the biggest misconception. It's done in chunks and bits and pieces, and there's actually good instructions and guidelines for how to fit those chunks and pieces together so that you have a continuous narrative. But you're right, most beginning writers don't know that. And it's a tragedy because I think if more young people understood, it's like putting together any puzzle. This is just a puzzle with words. They wouldn't be discouraged in that way.
I love what you're saying because I think if there was anything that I could recommend for young people to learn, it's story structure. Learn how stories work. They have their favorite TV shows. Everyone has their favorite movie. Everyone has a song that they love that tells a story somehow. If they could understand how it was working, if that was something that was taught in school, I think that just like having music courses or art courses can get kids, get them in the mind frame of, oh, I'm not going to be a famous painter, but I like to paint on the weekends. If people were being taught, you can write a story. It can just be for fun, but you know how to fix it if you're
Yeah.
unhappy with it. I think that would be such an important part of creating what I believe every human being is, which are writers. Yeah.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
completely
that's
agree.
very,
Completely.
very encouraging, very much so. So how did you break that 40-year chasm? What got you back into writing?
So I remember taking a course just a few years ago from James Scott Bell, who is a famous writer, and he had done a similar thing, yeah, where he had, he'd wanted to write, he'd liked it, but it doesn't pay bills, so he became a lawyer instead. And he talks about that there was one time he went out with his wife and they went to a movie. I don't remember which movie it was, but there was something about this movie that moved him so much. When he was walking out of the theater, he said to her, I've got to write. I want us to make stories like what I just saw. Well, that happened to me. I saw a film and I loved it so much. It spoke so deeply. It was like something just was resurrected in my heart. And it wasn't that I necessarily did it, that it was such an epiphany like what Bell describes, but I just started to say, no, I want to understand how this story worked. How did this story work? Why did I cry after I watched this film? How did they do it? And so once I started learning about story structure and about beats and about all the different things, I started to go, I think I could do this. I think this is what I was missing 40 years ago. Okay, well, it's too late. I'm 50 years old. It's too late, but I could do it for fun. Just because I like this one movie. Maybe I could kind of imitate the story that this one was. So I started doing that, and the story ideas that I had kept getting stronger and stronger. And because I had activated that part of our brain, that subconscious that wants to give you story, it went, oh, you want some story again after 40 years? Well, here, let me give you some stuff that, I just sat on all that time that you didn't pay attention to me. And then the ideas start coming and coming and coming. So that's another thing I'd say is, don't feel like, okay, it's been so long. No, just like you say, Victoria, that stories, those stories are collecting in your head because we're wired for story. It's all in there. It's just waiting. It's just waiting for you to be ready to start telling it. So once you learn how to access it, you'll have that 40 years. You won't have the 40 years of time, but you'll have the 40 years of story that'll start to come back to you.
And how'd you go about doing it? When it, did you put pen to paper? Did you get a new journal?
Yeah, that's
your method.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what worked for me. And part of this was a discovery in that I would make my own story. But I started to watch interviews with the director of the film that had really moved me. I started reading articles about people who had worked on the film and how it had been put together. So I basically kind of made that one film sort of become a little class, and just started searching on the internet, figuring out who the names and the credits, looking up these people, what had they learned, what did they know. And what started to happen was it was almost like the movie started to become a class, like a master class to me. And then from there, the particular director made mention of writers that had inspired his story. So I started reading those authors. And then as I'm reading those authors, I'm going, wait a minute. Oh, that reminds me of another author. Or when I was a kid, I read a book that was like, so there started to sort of become this spider web of starting to bring story into my life, other people's stories. Then I started to do what was a suggestion that another writer made, was that she's a young writer, and she said that she got started writing fan fiction. Now, if people aren't familiar with what fan fiction is, this is something where you sort of shortcut a little bit of the work of having to do character development and setting and world building. Take a story that you already love, that you feel like you know those characters really well because you've watched this movie or this series over and over, and start writing your own stories using those characters. Now, of course, I wouldn't recommend that you necessarily share those, or because, there can be copywriting issues, but it's a great exercise because half of the work of character and setting are already done for you. And using what you're learning about story structure or about character development, start applying it in a place that's completely safe because you're not having to do all that extra work. And that was what I started to do. I started to write fan fiction against this film because I was learning so much about the characters and the setting. What started to happen then was these characters started to morph away from what the original content was and started to bring on personalities beyond what the film was, and more to the kind of characters that I was interested in. And slowly what happened was these characters became completely different people that now I work with in my story.
Oh, very interesting.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and
Isn't
how?
it funny how becoming a student, everyone, I believe every great writer, every good writer needs an entry point into the craft. And if you haven't had the good fortune to either, have studied it at university or maybe been in a workshop or, if you haven't had any of those entry points, something that's available to all of us are the stories that we love, whether it's books or movies or series, like you said. There's many kinds of media that can be your point of entry. But I love it that you said, essentially what you did is you took this one story that you loved and you became a student of story using that as the vehicle. And
Exactly.
you did it yourself. You followed your zone of fascination and allowed yourself to just indulge in flexing that muscle of what makes this work? Why do I love it? What piece do I want to tackle and try on my own? You essentially gave yourself the gift of becoming a student of the story. If everyone who wants to write could simply do that one thing, that is a game changer.
Absolutely. And I love what you said about indulging yourself, because I think that is one thing that I did not learn at 14 and I'm only now beginning to really understand, is that this is a gift to yourself. Yes, you will write something, or you hope to write something that will be a gift to other people. But ultimately, what you're starting on here is a journey of your life. You are going to be bringing a very unique person out into the world through your stories. And so there has to be some love of yourself in it. And what I've found too, in the 2 years now that I've been doing this, I have learned more about my own self. I've come to a much more healthy emotional and mental place through writing, because the characters can be your space of, hey, this is something I've worked with my life, or this is something that I've struggled with my whole life. You know what? I'll have my character struggle with that. And then by watching them struggle, it's almost as if you get to live vicariously through them and you start to do the healing. So I'm not saying that writing is a substitute for therapy. I do not mean that. But I believe that story can be a companion to any kind of emotional or trauma work that you're doing. This can be part of the journey, and it can be a precious artifact of the journey, because you can look at the characters when they were you a year ago and see how they have changed along with you in the story. So again, those aren't necessarily things you would share with people. I know I have parts of my story that I've written, no one will ever read those scenes. Those are gone. But it's as if they really happened, because they happened in my journey with them.
Very good, very good. So what was the bridge from your study of this film and your work with fan fiction to the point where you are now, 2 years down the road, where you are publishing your Substack and opening it up to others to read and offer suggestions?
Well, one of the things that I did learn was the concept of drafts. And I also learned something that was really, along with drafts, the concept of the rule of 9. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but the rule of 9 states that for every 10 ideas that you have, only one of them will be good. So in the course of knowing that for every, especially important story beats or important characteristic moments for a character, knowing that for each one of those, I had to come up with at least 10 different versions of that to come up with something that would not be easily, I don't know exactly. Tropes are not bad, so I don't mean it would be tropey, but it would be something that maybe has been done before. You know, we all kind of have that sense. We start to read a book and we're like, oh, I know where this is going. You don't want that. So by coming up with 10 ideas, your brain will start to bring the ideas that have not been used very much. So in the course of doing that, though, in the 9 ideas, you come up with some really great stuff, or at least some useful things, but they can't all be used. So I was starting to get to the point where I was producing, 7, 8, 9 versions of this scene, and I didn't want to lose them. But you've got to set them aside and take the one you're going to use. And so I started to get the idea, well, what if I produce them? Like, what if I had some way of saving them and then being able to look back at them later on. And maybe then if I get stuck, if I start having writer's block, I can look back at these old versions and maybe get some inspiration for how to do the next scene or another scene or even another story. And so I was reading where one writer had mentioned that he published his rejects. And that was his selling point for his commercial genre fiction, was he would allow his subscribers to see the kind of like what they'll have in films. These are the outtakes. These are the scenes that didn't get made. And sometimes, for some reason, fans are interested in that. And so he started making that his newsletter. And it occurred to me, well, I had that kind of thing. And then I also had, conversations that I had had about the characters or with the characters or things like that, little experiments. So I thought, well, you know what if I start publishing them? Not because I necessarily wanted people to read them, but more just to see my work in print. Because that's another joy that I, as a 14-year-old girl, that I had, was this idea of seeing your book in print. It's a way of getting it in print without actually having to worry about the publishing, and then giving you that feeling of, oh, I'm a real writer, to kind of overcome that imposter syndrome. I see how I'm really producing something. And that sort of creates this energy to keep producing. So I actually had a blog earlier, but it was just too much work to put the blog together. So when I discovered Substacks, it allows you to create something that looks like you, but it's not so much time in the layout and the design and the configuration. It's pretty much straightforward, and your content belongs to you. So you never worry that you've put it on a site and now you don't really own it 100%. On Substack, it's yours. You can take it down, move it, do whatever you want. So I chose Substack, but there's nothing unique about Substack. It's just that's what I chose. And so what I first started doing was just throwing up things on there that I had considered interesting, or, well, I kind of like that, but I don't like this part, or this won't work. Or I started putting all my rejected things up there. And at this point, I also put up like reviews. I'll do I'll take a movie, or I'll take a series episode, and I'll do like a breakdown. I'll do a practice to see if I can break it down by the beats and just say, okay, I see what's happening in this beat. I'll do reviews. Like I'll do like watch a film for the first time and then do like a reaction, like take notes as I'm watching it and then type those in verbatim afterwards. And also just scenes, character analysis, just kind of whatever I'm doing right now in the story. The whole point for me on the Substack is just keeping me producing, getting me where I have that sense of every day something goes up there, every day something goes up there. Sometimes I'll take a couple weeks off if I can kind of feel like it's starting to feel like a burden. I'll take time off. But what I found is that because you've got the subconscious working, it thinks it needs to produce. It somehow gets the idea, oh yeah, you need to do 3 more Substacks. Here, let me give you 3 more ideas. So the ideas just start to kind of grow upon themselves, and it hasn't been as difficult as I expected.
I love the research.
This is so fascinating, because haven't you found, I mean, you mentioned imposter syndrome, and everyone battles with that, whether you're starting something new or you're on your 40th thing, it doesn't matter. You still question yourself. Can I do this? Am I capable? Am I worthy? I mean, everyone goes through that. But what's so fascinating is when you set that goal so that I have this task, and this task requires me to be a writer. That's not just what I'm doing, that's who I am. So you're redefining how you define yourself. And if you're defining yourself based on your actions as writer, there's no room in there for imposter. They can't coexist, because you're doing it, and you've set this task for yourself, and then you just fulfill it and you do it. So that's fascinating to me, that once you find that way, like you said, whether you're writing fan fiction, you're writing reviews, you're developing your own work, whatever that looks like, and wherever you're doing it, if you set that task for yourself, where by definition you have to write, you are a writer, it takes care of that problem, don't you think?
I completely agree. And I love too what you're saying, because I think one of the fears that I had was that I was going to run out of ideas. And when I read writers that I love throughout, throughout the 19th, 20th century, that is, I mean, there are writers that I know that are so prolific. They created one of my favorite writers, he wrote 10 books. When he died, he had literally 1,000 pages of notes that he would use for creating more work. And in his notes, oh, I'm running out of ideas. Well, I just don't have any more ideas. So your brain is giving you the ideas in a rhythm. And so you worry that they're not there, but they're there. They're coming. But like you said, if you can just make this a habit, it's like your subconscious just goes, oh, yeah, I got to give you something tonight. Oh, yeah, here you go. But you have to create that almost inevitability, I would say, that an idea is going to come. And your brain wants to give you what you want. It wants to do that for you. But you have to, as you say, you have to create the sense that there's a space for that to come, because your brain's not stupid. It knows that if you're asking for something and then you have no place to put it, well, it'd rather just go watch TV. But if it knows you truly have something to put this to, it will give you what you want. Now, I'm not saying there's no such thing as writer's block, and I'm definitely not saying that sometimes you may need to take a break. But in general, I think that you start to have a confidence in your own mind that those ideas are there. And of course, as we all love our Zettelkasten, there is also additional ways that you can offload that fear of not having ideas. But even if you didn't have your Zettelkasten, having ideas is something your brain wants to give you. But I think this is what I learned from the 40 years of not doing it. And then saying, well, see, I don't have any ideas. What's the point? Well, your brain's just waiting for you to create the playground to go play on. So, so I really appreciate what you're saying there about that.
I totally agree. I think what you've just described encapsulates the difference between someone who doesn't write and finds reasons not to, for whatever those reasons are, like we all have, and the person who instead decides to have trust. I trust that I'm creative enough, I'm smart enough, I have enough imagination. I will figure this out. If I just make a space, I trust that the ideas will be there. And if you adopt that mindset, you will never run out of ideas. You won't be able to write them down fast enough, because like you said, if you make that ask of yourself and you trust that you will give yourself the answer, it will be there all day, every day.
And if I could just add in there too, also being willing to write badly, because there is also an element of, just as you can't get on the track after you've been sitting at your desk for 40 years and start running around the track and do a marathon that weekend, your brain does need that time to learn how to work through things. So another thing I think that happens with imposter syndrome is we hear, oh, you can do it. And we know we can, but we're worried that we're going to hate the work that it takes to actually build this muscle. The reality is that you will feel what I think of as feeling is nausea. It's not so much imposter syndrome, but it's like this nausea. As the story is difficult to get a hold of, as the characters, their motivations feel real fluffy, and you're trying to grab at this almost like quicksilver, it can give you the sense in your stomach that this is dumb. Why am I even doing this? Why? There's so many times that I would say to myself, why am I putting myself through this? So what I really like about what you're saying, Victoria, is that it's not really a mind over matter as much as it is finding the story that you must tell. That is a really important thing that you're getting at. So until you have that story that will not let you go, that's your goal. You may not be doing a lot of writing, but you're writing to find that story. And I know I'm a pantser myself, so a pantser might need to actually write a lot of junk story to find the scene. Like I know for myself, I wrote for a year, and it wasn't until I wrote like one scene, one piece, it was like everything kind of gelled. That's the story I want to tell. And that now it won't let go of me. The story will not let go. So I would say that's one of the first things too, is be willing to struggle for that story that is yours. And you have to tell this story. And when you have that, a lot of things become, I think that's again where the subconscious starts to step in And that can be a long period of feeling very sick to your stomach all the time you think about the story. But that story is out there. It exists. And all you're doing is trying to get to that story that already exists out there that's waiting for you.
Well, before we sign off, because you've given us so much wonderful, wonderful practical advice, can you let us know, is it difficult to set up an account on Substack and to post there?
Well, I'd say if you have a Facebook, Instagram, any of those kind of accounts where you had to set it up and you do posting or submit videos or anything like that, it's no different than any of that. Substack is the easiest experience I've ever had. I've used WordPress and I've used Tumblr and many other things, but this was the easiest one. Substack is very good too for providing assistance as far as their articles, and there's lots of videos on YouTube you can watch how to set up your Substack in 5 minutes or whatever. And I've never found that I've ever made a mistake that I wasn't able to fix in the design of it. So I would say, yeah, just get on and start messing around with it. And the worst that can happen is you decide you don't like something and you need to change it a little bit. It's very forgiving.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Just absolutely incredible and very inspirational. I hope that you will bring a lot of people back to their writing. I love how before we started recording, you were talking about wanting to be the person that's a little further down the path so you can help people shouting ahead, am I on the right path? You
keep moving. At least if you want to be where I am, keep moving.
And then if we want to, we'll watch Victoria for the little pebbles that she's left on the road in front of us. Oh, there's another Victoria pebble. Now I know I'm on the right path.
That's right. Yeah, the idea of community is such an important thing, I think, for writers, is to find a community where you really do feel supported, but you also know that you're going to get some tough love when you need it because you want to get better.
Well, then in that case, it's time for me to say, be sure to hop on over to LiLLiPub.org, where you're going to meet fascinating people. The three of us are all on LiLLiPub quite often. You'll find us there. You can chat with us. You can make your own posts. And more than anything, you can join us for our fusion writing meetings on Saturday. Victoria, what would you like to say to wind us up for the day?
Oh, this has been a feast. I'm so glad that Vanessa joined us. This is so good. And I look forward to having you back and also having other people come in and share their journey and their experiences and their hard-won lessons and just that advice. You know, as you said, it doesn't matter how far ahead or behind you someone is. We're all on the same chain. We're all taking the same journey, and that is to get those thoughts out of our head, to get them onto a page, and to connect with our readers. So I think I'm just so grateful that we have this community and these relationships that we can lean on when we need a little encouragement or when we need a little tough love. Either way, it's just nice that we're there for each other. So I can't wait to see what we do next.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you so much for coming. And thank you all for viewing, and we will see you over in LiLLiPub. Bye-bye.